My husband stood up at his lavish birthday dinner, clinked his crystal glass, and instead of a toast, slid a thick manila envelope across the table. He smirked and announced to his entire family that he had outgrown our marriage and that all future communication would go through his lawyer. I did not cry or beg. I simply smiled, replied, understood, and within 3 minutes, I used my phone to freeze every single bank account funding his fake luxury lifestyle. When the waiter brought the $2,000 bill a few moments later, my husband quickly learned what communicating through a lawyer actually costs. Before I get into exactly how I dismantled his entire reality by the time dessert arrived, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had to put an arrogant man in his place and take back your power, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how this played out. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old and I work as a wealth management consultant. I spend my days analyzing assets, mitigating risks, and protecting investments. But for the past 5 years, my biggest financial liability was sitting right across from me, wearing a bespoke velvet dinner jacket I had paid for. It was a Saturday night, and we were seated in the private wine room of the most exclusive premium steakhouse downtown. I had personally arranged and paid the hefty deposit for this entire evening to celebrate my husband Terrence turning 37. The mahogany table was packed with his closest friends and his family. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the spread of dry-aged tomahawk steaks, truffle macaroni, and imported seafood towers. Terrence was holding court at the head of the table, laughing loudly and pouring expensive champagne into the glasses of his boys. He loved playing the role of the self-made boss. He ran a luxury lifestyle brand that produced nothing but oversized ego and massive credit card debt. He loved talking about his vision, his grind, and his alpha mindset. Meanwhile, I was the one working 50-hour weeks at a corporate firm to keep the lights on in our home and keep his leased Porsche in the driveway. Sitting to my left was his mother, Miss Shirley. She spent the entire dinner doting on him, wiping a spot of sauce from his chin, like he was a toddler, and shooting me subtle glares. Miss Shirley never liked me. She always felt I was too ambitious, too corporate, and lacked the soft, submissive qualities a man like her son supposedly needed to thrive. Beside her sat Terrence's older brother Jamal, a quiet man who usually kept his head down, and Jamal's wife, Heather. Heather was a white woman who had married into the family 3 years ago and immediately appointed herself the expert on all things relating to Black culture, business, and family dynamics. She sat there swirling her wine, occasionally dropping condescending remarks about how my demanding career was probably stifling Terrence's creative genius. I ignored her just like I always did, choosing to sip my sparkling water and let Terrence enjoy his special night. As the plates were cleared and the waiters began bringing out the coffee, the room grew slightly quieter. Terrence tapped his knife against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp clink caught everyone's attention. The laughter died down and his friends raised their glasses, expecting a heartfelt speech about brotherhood success, and maybe, just maybe, a word of gratitude for the wife who had orchestrated and funded the entire gathering. Instead, Terrence reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He did not look at me with love or even basic respect. His eyes were cold, calculated, and dripping with an arrogance that made my stomach tighten. He tossed the envelope onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right next to my coffee cup. "I have outgrown this marriage, Kendra," he said, his voice loud and clear enough for every single person in the private room to hear. The silence that followed was suffocating. Miss Shirley stopped chewing. Jamal shifted awkwardly in his leather chair. The waiter who was pouring water in the corner froze. Terrence puffed out his chest, looking around at his friends for validation before locking his gaze back on me. "I need a woman who respects my vision. Someone who understands where I am going. I am filing for divorce. From this second on, all communication goes through my lawyer, Mr. Sterling." He crossed his arms and smirked. It was a sickening theatrical performance. He had chosen this exact moment, surrounded by his enablers and friends, to ambush me. He wanted an audience. He wanted to see the strong, composed wealth manager break down, cry, and cause a hysterical scene in a high-end restaurant. He wanted to humiliate me so completely that I would be too shattered to fight back when he inevitably tried to take half of everything I had built. I looked down at the envelope. The name of a notoriously sleazy local divorce attorney was printed in the top left corner. I felt a brief, sharp sting of betrayal in my chest, a fleeting reminder of the vows we took and the years I had wasted trying to lift this man up. But the tears he was waiting for never came. Instead, the emotional fog cleared, leaving behind nothing but cold, pure clarity. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a voice broke the heavy silence. It was Heather. She leaned across the table, invading my space, her face arranged in an expression of exaggerated fake sympathy. "It is for the best, Kendra," Heather whispered, though her voice carried easily across the quiet table. "You really have to understand. Terrence is an alpha male. He is a builder. He simply cannot be tied down by a woman who tries to control his finances and manage his life like one of her corporate portfolios. You two are just on different paths." Miss Shirley nodded in agreement from the other side of the table, offering no comfort to the woman who had paid her medical bills for the last 3 years. Terrence looked incredibly pleased with himself, soaking in the defense provided by his sister-in-law. He reached for his champagne glass, looking like a man who had just won a war without having to fight a single battle. He thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought my silence was shock. He thought I was paralyzed by the suddenness of his cruelty. He did not realize that I was not breaking down. I was calculating. You do not survive a decade in wealth management without learning how to identify a bad investment and ruthlessly cut your losses. And right now, Terrence was the worst investment of my life. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. I reached out, placed my manicured hand flat over the thick envelope, and looked him dead in the eye. A slow, calm smile spread across my face. "Understood," I said softly. The words sliced through the thick tension in the room. I slowly pulled my hand back, leaving the envelope sitting exactly where he had thrown it, and calmly picked up my phone from my purse. Heather let out a short, patronizing laugh and took a slow sip of her wine. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason, Kendra," she said, her tone dripping with that unbearable superiority she always carried. "A man like Terrence needs to build his empire. He needs capital support and freedom, not a wife constantly hovering over his balance sheets and nagging him about budgets. You just do not understand the mind of a true entrepreneur." I did not bother looking up from my screen as I typed in my complex, secure passcode. "Oh, I understand perfectly, Heather," I replied, my voice remarkably steady and light. "It takes a massive amount of capital to build an empire, especially an empire that has not turned a single dollar of actual profit in 5 full years." Terrence scoffed loudly from the head of the table. "Do not start with your corporate accounting nonsense tonight, Kendra," he warned, leaning back in his leather chair and unbuttoning his velvet suit jacket. "My brand is in the scaling phase. You build the infrastructure first, you establish the market presence, and then the money follows. It is called having a vision. But I would not expect someone who punches a clock for a paycheck to grasp that kind of high-level strategy." Punching a clock. That was his dismissive term for my position as a senior wealth management consultant at one of the top financial firms in the state. The position that required me to be in the office by 7 in the morning while he slept until noon. The position that paid the mortgage on the 4-bedroom house he lived in. The position that single-handedly funded his scaling phase, which, as far as I could tell, consisted entirely of lavish networking trips to Miami, purchasing designer clothes to look the part on social media, and leasing a luxury sports car to maintain his image. His luxury lifestyle brand was nothing more than a glorified internet page, selling overpriced apparel with his logo on it, all entirely financed by my corporate salary. I opened my primary banking portal. Terrence was completely oblivious to the digital execution about to take place right in front of him. He was already turning his attention back to his friends, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. The men sitting around the table, men who had happily eaten my food and drank my liquor for years, chuckled and raised their glasses in solidarity with him. "Yeah, man," Terrence bragged, clapping his best man heavily on the shoulder. "Miami next month. Just the boys. We are going to rent a yacht, pop some bottles, and celebrate my new chapter. Total freedom. No more asking for permission to live my life. Total freedom," I thought to myself. "Let us give you exactly what you asked for." I navigated to the business account settings. This was a joint limited liability company operating account in name only. I had set it up years ago to help him get his business off the ground, but every single cent flowing into it came directly from my personal earnings. Terrence did not even know the administrative login credentials. I tapped the screen once, initiating a hard freeze on the account. A prompt asked me to confirm the action. I hit confirm. The status instantly changed from active to restricted. Next, I opened the credit card management tab. There it was. The Platinum Amex. The card he used to buy the very velvet jacket he was currently wearing. The card he used to buy the endless rounds of expensive drinks for his friends tonight. The card that had a $20,000 limit backed entirely by my pristine credit score. I selected the option to report the card as lost or stolen. Another prompt appeared on my screen. I hit confirm. The status changed to canceled immediately. Finally, I scrolled down to the scheduled automatic transfers. I found the recurring monthly payment for the Porsche Carrera, $2,400 a month. The vehicle, he insisted, was a necessary business expense to project an image of success to potential investors who miraculously never materialized. A beautiful car for a successful chief executive officer, but a terrible, crippling liability for an unemployed man who had just demanded a divorce from his sole investor. I tapped Cancel Autopay and hit confirm one last time. It took less than 60 seconds. 60 seconds to completely sever the financial artery that kept his fake billionaire lifestyle alive. I locked my phone, slid it back into my leather clutch, and picked up my glass of sparkling water. Terrence was still holding court. He was loudly telling his friends about a luxury penthouse apartment downtown that he was planning to tour next week, bragging about the floor-to-ceiling windows and the rooftop pool. Miss Shirley was beaming at him from across the table, visibly thrilled that her golden boy was finally shedding the dead weight of a working wife who dared to hold him accountable. Heather was busy texting on her phone, probably gossiping with her country club friends about how gracefully she had just put me in my place. I just sat there taking a slow sip of my crisp lemon water. It is truly amazing how calm you can be when you know the explosion is only moments away. I did not need to scream or cry or make a scene to defend my honor. I just needed to wait for the check. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany door of the private room opened and the head waiter entered carrying a sleek black leather folder. He approached the head of the table with practiced elegance, navigating around the empty champagne flutes and dessert plates. "Thank you for celebrating with us tonight, sir," the waiter said, placing the folder respectfully next to Terrence. Terrence did not even bother to look at the itemized receipt inside. He wanted to make a show of it. He wanted everyone in the room to see how generous, how wealthy, and how utterly unbothered he was by the divorce he had just initiated. He casually reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out the sleek metallic platinum Amex, and tossed it onto the leather folder with a loud authoritative clack. "Take care of that," he told the waiter with a dismissive wave of his hand. "And add a 20% gratuity for yourself. I am in a generous mood tonight." The waiter smiled, bowed slightly, and stepped out of the room to process the payment. Terrence leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and shot me a victorious, mocking grin across the table, completely unaware that his financial life support had just been permanently pulled. The heavy mahogany door opened again. The head waiter stepped back into the private wine room, but his practiced elegance had completely vanished. He held the sleek black leather folder tightly against his chest, and his face was pale and tight with extreme discomfort. He did not approach Terrence with the same deference he had shown just 5 minutes ago. Instead, he walked rigidly to the head of the table and leaned down. "Sir," the waiter whispered, clearly trying to preserve some shred of dignity for the table. "I am so sorry, but this card has been heavily declined." The soft background music in the restaurant suddenly seemed completely silent. Terrence blinked, his smug grin faltering for just a fraction of a second before his massive ego overrode reality. He let out a loud theatrical laugh, looking around at his friends to make sure they saw how unbothered he was. "Declined." Terrence chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "That is impossible. It is a platinum business card. Run it again. Your machine is probably malfunctioning. You know how these archaic banking systems are." "I have run it 3 separate times, sir," the waiter replied, his voice a little firmer and louder this time. "The bank has placed a hard freeze on the account. It says the card has been reported lost or cancelled. Do you have another form of payment? The total balance is $2,040. Terrence's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. The confident alpha male energy drained out of him instantly. The boys sitting around the table suddenly found their empty dessert plates incredibly interesting. Nobody made eye contact. Heather stopped texting her country club friends. Miss Shirley looked entirely confused, her eyes darting frantically between her golden child son and the impatient waiter. Terrence reached into his velvet jacket, patted his empty pockets, and then shot a desperate, angry glare at me across the table. "Kendra," he snapped, dropping the independent boss act entirely. "Call the concierge line right now and clear this up. They must have flagged the purchase as fraud because we are at a premium venue. Fix it." He spoke to me like I was his subordinate. Like the divorce he had just aggressively demanded in front of his entire family was nothing more than a minor administrative hiccup that I still needed to manage for him. He actually expected the woman he had just humiliated to immediately bail him out of the very trap he had set for himself. I did not reach for my phone. I did not break eye contact. I picked up my leather clutch and smoothly stood up from the table, taking a moment to straighten the skirt of my dress. I looked at him with absolute terrifying calm. "I am sorry, Terrence," I said, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the silent room. "I cannot talk to you about financial matters anymore. You made it very clear in front of all your friends here that from this second on all communication must go through your lawyer. And unfortunately, Mr. Sterling is not here to authorize this transaction." The color completely vanished from Terrence's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization of what I had just done finally slammed into him like a freight train. He looked at my calm expression, and he finally understood that the financial infrastructure of his entire life had just been completely demolished. I unzipped my clutch and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. I tossed them lightly onto the center of the mahogany table. "That covers my steak, my sparkling water, and my valet tip," I announced confidently. "The rest of this massive bill is on the successful entrepreneur. Happy birthday, Terrence." As I turned to leave the room, instantly erupted into chaos. Miss Shirley slammed her hands down on the table, her gold rings clattering sharply against the wood. "Kendra," she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the glass walls of the wine cellar. "How dare you? How dare you embarrass my son like this on his birthday in front of his friends? You are a spiteful, bitter woman. Pay this bill right now. You are his wife." "Not anymore," I replied, not even bothering to look back at her furious face. He made sure of that. Heather jumped up from her chair, her face red with supreme indignation. "You cannot just leave him here, Kendra," she yelled, completely forgetting her condescending speech about alpha males from 10 minutes ago. "He does not have his other bank cards on him. This is financial abuse. I am telling you right now, my father is a judge, and he will absolutely hear about this. Then tell your father to come down here and pay for your truffle macaroni, Heather," I said over my shoulder, keeping my pace steady. "Because my charity foundation is officially permanently closed." I grabbed my coat and walked toward the heavy wooden door. Behind me, the panic was fully setting in. Terrence was stammering, demanding his friends chip in to cover the dinner. I heard Jamal quietly say he only had a debit card with $200 on it. The big ballers, the men who were supposed to be renting luxury yachts in Miami next month, were suddenly frantically checking their banking apps and patting down their pockets like frightened college students who forgot their wallets. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the main dining room. The air felt incredibly lighter out here. The heavy, oppressive weight of carrying a grown man's fragile ego had finally been lifted off my shoulders. I took a deep breath of the expensive steak-scented air and felt a genuine radiant smile spread across my face for the first time in months. As I walked gracefully toward the front entrance, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor, I glanced back toward the private room one last time. Through the glass partition, I saw the general manager of the steakhouse, a tall, imposing man in a sharp-tailored suit, briskly walking past me. He was flanked by two large, unsmiling security guards. They were heading straight for Terrence's table. Terrence was standing up now, waving his arms frantically, his expensive velvet jacket looking absolutely ridiculous as he tried to negotiate with the head waiter. His friends were physically slinking back in their leather chairs, desperately trying to distance themselves from the sinking ship. Miss Shirley was clutching her pearls, looking absolutely horrified as the strict restaurant manager stepped into the room to demand the remaining $1,700. I handed my ticket to the coat check attendant, tipped her a generous $20 bill, and stepped out into the cool night air. My phone instantly buzzed in my purse. It was a frantic text message from Terrence. It was a string of angry, cursing emojis, followed by a desperate demand to unfreeze the accounts immediately so he would not get arrested for theft of services. I swiped the notification away, blocked his number, and signaled for my waiting car. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted it on his terms. Now he was going to learn exactly what it meant to live without my funding. And the most beautiful part was this was only the first night of his new reality. 48 hours had passed since I walked out of that steakhouse, and the silence in my home had been absolutely glorious. Terrence had not returned. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I learned he had been forced to call his older brother Jamal to come bail him out of the restaurant bill. That desperate act had completely drained Jamal's checking account and caused a massive argument between Jamal and Heather. As for Terrence, his leased Porsche was currently parked in the driveway of Miss Shirley's house, completely immobile because he could not even afford to put premium fuel in the tank. My phone had been a constant barrage of blocked notifications and voicemails from unknown numbers, but my actual physical environment was entirely peaceful. It was Sunday morning. I was sitting at my massive marble kitchen island, wearing a silk robe, sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. The sunlight was pouring through the large bay windows of the home that I had purchased solely under my name before Terrence and I even got married. Soft jazz was playing quietly from the overhead speakers. For the first time in 5 years, I was not spending my weekend balancing ledgers to cover my husband's reckless spending. I was finally breathing. That peace shattered precisely at noon. I heard the electronic keypad on my front door chime loudly. Terrence must have given his mother the access code. The heavy wooden front door swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud, and the sound of angry marching footsteps echoed through the hardwood hallway. Miss Shirley and Heather barged right into my kitchen. They were still wearing their extravagant Sunday church clothes. Miss Shirley had on a massive purple hat and a matching tailored suit, clutching her oversized leather Bible against her chest like a weapon. Heather was right behind her in a modest floral dress, looking like a smug, self-appointed moral compass ready to deliver a lecture. They did not knock. They did not announce themselves. The sheer audacity of these two women entering my sanctuary uninvited was astounding. Miss Shirley did not even bother to say hello. She marched right up to the kitchen island, her face contorted with absolute rage. "What kind of evil, vindictive woman are you?" she screamed, slamming her hand down on the polished marble countertop. I did not flinch. I slowly lowered my coffee mug and looked at her. My son is sitting on my living room couch right now, humiliated and broke. Miss Shirley yelled, her voice trembling with anger. He could not even drive himself to church this morning because his cards are declining at the gas station. He had to ride in the back seat with Jamal like a child. You froze his business accounts. You canceled his credit cards. You left him completely stranded. This is financial abuse, Kendra, plain and simple. Heather stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest and shaking her head in exaggerated disappointment. It really is disgraceful, Kendra, she chimed in, using that soft, patronizing tone she always used when she was trying to sound intellectually superior. We just came from the Sunday service, and the pastor preached an entire sermon about grace, forgiveness, and supporting your family. You are acting incredibly petty, just because Terrence decided he needs to find his own path. Legally speaking, you cannot just financially isolate your spouse out of spite. You always thought you were better than my son, Miss Shirley yelled over Heather, pointing a sharply manicured finger directly at my face. You have always looked down on him just because you sit in some fancy glass office and wear those expensive corporate suits all day. You think your little finance degree makes you a better person than him. She took a deep, angry breath, clutching her Bible tighter. A real black woman supports her man's dreams. She lifts him up when he is building his legacy. She does not cut him off at the knees the second things get a little difficult. Terrence is an entrepreneur. He is trying to build something for your future, and you are trying to destroy his business just to punish him for wanting a divorce. The kitchen fell silent, save for the soft jazz still playing in the background. They both stared at me, breathing heavily, waiting for me to crack. They expected me to start defending myself. They expected me to argue back, to cry, or to feel guilty for not being the submissive, endlessly supportive wife they demanded I be. Instead, I took another slow, calm sip of my coffee. I carefully placed the mug down on a leather coaster. I smoothed out the sleeves of my silk robe and stood up, making sure I was looking down at both of them. I am not trying to destroy his business. Miss Shirley, I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. I am simply refusing to fund his delusions any longer. Miss Shirley opened her mouth to yell again, but I held up a single finger, silencing her instantly. You want to talk about supporting his dreams? I continued, my tone shifting from calm to clinically precise. Let us talk about the actual numbers. Because unlike Terrence, I do not operate on vision boards, motivational quotes, and empty promises. I operate on data. And the data is very ugly. I walked around the kitchen island, closing the distance between us. Heather took a small step back, her smug expression slightly faltering. Over the past 5 years, I have poured exactly $400,000 of my own hard-earned corporate salary into his so-called luxury lifestyle brand, I stated, enunciating every single syllable. $400,000, Miss Shirley. That is nearly $500,000 of my money injected directly into his vision. Miss Shirley blinked, genuinely taken aback by the exact figure. Terrence had always maintained the illusion that he was self-sufficient, and she had always chosen to believe him. That money did not go into business infrastructure. I said, my voice gaining momentum. It did not go into product development or marketing research or securing patents. It went into $5,000 networking trips to Miami, where absolutely no actual networking occurred. It went into $1,000 velvet dinner jackets so he could look wealthy on social media. It went into paying the $2,400 monthly lease on a luxury sports car that he uses exclusively to drive to high-end bars to pretend he is a chief executive officer. I stopped right in front of Miss Shirley, looking deep into her angry eyes. 5 years of complete financial devotion. $500,000 of my money. And do you know what the return on that massive investment has been? Neither of them spoke. The bravado had completely evaporated from the room. Zero, I said softly. Not a single dime of actual profit. His company is a financial black hole that exists purely to stroke his ego. I did not cut off a successful businessman, Miss Shirley. I cut off a 37-year-old dependent who just aggressively fired his primary sponsor. But he is your husband, Miss Shirley whispered, her voice losing all of its previous fire. You took vows to support him for better or for worse. And he handed me a divorce petition in the middle of a restaurant while eating a steak that I paid for. I snapped back, the cold reality of my words hitting them both like a physical blow. He wanted out. He wanted to be a free alpha male. I just gave him exactly what he asked for. He is free to build his empire now. He just has to do it with his own money. Heather quickly recovered her composure, stepping forward to defend her mother-in-law. "Well, Kendra," she said, her voice tight and defensive. "You can throw all the corporate numbers around that you want, but you cannot just lock him out of his own life." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her phone. "Actually, Kendra, in this state, marital assets are split 50-50. You cannot legally lock him out of the accounts, and you certainly cannot keep him out of this house. My dad is a judge, so I know exactly how the family court system works. You are going to owe him half of everything, including the equity in this property, so you might want to drop the arrogant attitude before his lawyer takes you for everything you have." I looked at Heather, admiring her absolute unearned confidence. She really thought she had the ultimate trump card. She thought she could intimidate me with vague legal threats and her father's resume. I gave her a warm, genuine smile. "Is that right, Heather?" I asked sweetly. I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen, heading straight for my home office down the hall. I could hear them whispering behind me, probably congratulating themselves on putting me in my place. I walked over to my wall safe, entered the combination, and pulled out a single thick manila folder. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the heavy folder right onto the marble island in front of Heather. "Read it," I commanded, "since you are such a legal expert." Heather looked down at the heavy manila folder sitting on my marble countertop. For a second she did not move. She just stared at it like it was a live explosive. Then she reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents and began to scan the first page. I stood there watching her eyes dart rapidly across the thick paragraphs of legally binding text. It took exactly 15 seconds for the smug, patronizing color to completely drain out of her face. She swallowed hard and quickly flipped to the second page, then the third, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as the reality of my financial fortress revealed itself to her. "What is it?" Heather Miss Shirley demanded, leaning closer to look at the papers she did not understand. "What did she do to my boy?" Heather did not answer immediately. She just stared at the signature line on the fourth page. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Allow me to translate for the judge's daughter," I said smoothly. "That is a rock-solid prenuptial agreement, accompanied by a fully executed limited liability company structuring form and an irrevocable trust charter. I did not spend 10 years building a career in wealth management just to let an arrogant man gamble my assets away on velvet jackets and mimosas." I walked around the island and tapped my finger directly on the highlighted section of the document Heather was holding. "When Terrence and I got married, he was so eager to play the role of the wealthy entrepreneur that he barely skimmed the paperwork my legal team drafted," I explained. "He signed exactly where he was told to sign. If he had actually read it, he would have realized that he owns absolutely nothing. The 4-bedroom house you are standing in right now is not marital property. It is legally owned by an independent trust registered under my late mother's maiden name. Terrence is not on the deed. He is not on the mortgage. Legally speaking, he is nothing more than a long-term house guest." Miss Shirley let out a loud gasp, taking a physical step back as if I had just struck her. "You tricked him!" she yelled. "You evil woman, you tricked my son out of his own home." "I did not trick anyone, Miss Shirley," I replied sharply. "I protected myself. He signed those documents willingly in front of a licensed notary. And it does not stop with the house." I turned my attention back to Heather, who was now nervously biting her lower lip. "Go ahead and read the corporate structure for his luxury lifestyle brand, Heather," I suggested. "Read the part about equity." Heather cleared her throat, looking down at the papers. "It says here that Kendra is the sole managing member and primary financial backer of the limited liability company." She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Terrence is listed as an independent contractor. He has zero equity in the brand. That is exactly right. I smiled. I own the business. I own the accounts. I own the trademark for his little lifestyle brand. Terrence has zero equity, zero leverage, and absolutely zero claim to a 50-50 split of my assets. So please, Heather, feel free to call your father and ask him how the family court system works. But unless your father is a federal judge specializing in complex corporate trust law, I highly suggest you pack up your little floral purse and walk out of my kitchen before I have you removed for trespassing. Heather looked absolutely defeated. The arrogant white woman who had proudly marched into my home to lecture me on black family dynamics and marital law was suddenly reduced to a stuttering mess. She dropped the documents back onto the marble island as if they had burned her hands. Miss Shirley was hyperventilating now. She gripped her leather Bible so tightly her knuckles were turning white. "You cannot do this, Kendra," she pleaded, her anger completely replaced by sheer panic. "He is your husband. You cannot just leave him with nothing. He will be ruined. Where is he supposed to go? How is he supposed to live? He is a strong alpha male." I reminded them, echoing the exact words Heather had used to insult me at the steakhouse. "He is a visionary. I am sure he will figure it out." Just as Miss Shirley opened her mouth to beg me again, the heavy silence of the house was violently shattered. A furious, aggressive pounding erupted at my front door. The heavy wood rattled under the force of whoever was striking it. Then the doorbell began to ring frantically over and over again in a continuous, obnoxious chime that echoed down the hallway. Miss Shirley jumped. Heather spun around, looking toward the front of the house. "That is Terrence," Miss Shirley said, her voice filled with sudden, desperate hope. "That is my boy. He came back to talk sense into you." I walked calmly over to the wall-mounted security monitor next to the refrigerator and tapped the screen to pull up the front porch camera. It was Terrence. But he was not alone. He was soaking wet with sweat, looking entirely disheveled in the same clothes he had worn to his birthday dinner 2 nights ago. Standing right next to him was an older white man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. I immediately recognized him from the business card Terrence had thrown at me. It was Mr. Sterling, the sleazy divorce attorney he had hired to intimidate me. Terrence stopped ringing the bell and leaned close to the door. "Kendra," he yelled through the thick wood, his voice muffled but undeniably furious. "Open this door right now. I know my mother is in there. I brought my lawyer. We are getting into the home office and I am taking my computer equipment and my business files. Open the door before we call the police and have you arrested for withholding my property." Heather rushed to the security monitor, looking at the screen. "You have to let them in, Kendra," she urged, finding a tiny scrap of her lost confidence. "He brought legal representation. You cannot deny him access to his own work equipment. That is illegal." I looked at the monitor, watching Terrence practically foaming at the mouth as he banged his fist against my door. I looked at his cheap lawyer, who was checking his watch and looking thoroughly unbothered. Then I looked down at my phone resting on the kitchen island. I did not feel fear. I did not feel threatened. I felt overwhelming sense of anticipation. Terrence thought he could bully his way back into my house by bringing a bargain bin lawyer to my front porch. He had no idea that I had already anticipated his next move hours ago. "Are you going to open the door or not?" Miss Shirley demanded, rushing toward the hallway. "If you do not open it, I will." "I would not do that if I were you, Miss Shirley," I warned, picking up my phone and unlocking the screen. "Because you are about to see exactly what happens when you try to launch a hostile takeover on my property." I kept my eyes locked on the security monitor as Miss Shirley froze in her tracks just a few feet from the front door. The frantic pounding stopped for a brief moment. Then the nasal, overly confident voice of Terrence's cheap lawyer filtered through the heavy wood. "Kendra, open this door immediately!" Mr. Sterling shouted, his tone dripping with fake legal authority. "I am advising my client to contact local law enforcement. You are illegally withholding his property and marital assets. If you do not grant us access to the home office right now, we will have the police escort us inside, and you will be facing criminal charges." Heather let out a loud breath of relief in the kitchen. "See?" she whispered to Miss Shirley. I told you, you cannot just lock a man out of his own house. They are calling the cops. I did not even look at them. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the warm caffeine course through my system. Then I looked down at my phone, opened my comprehensive smart home security application, and pressed a single red button labeled Perimeter Defense. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots echoed from the back hallway leading to the kitchen. Miss Shirley spun around, clutching her chest in sheer terror. Heather stumbled backward, knocking her hip against the marble island. Two massive, broad-shouldered men stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlit kitchen. They were private security contractors I had retained the moment I walked out of that steakhouse. They were dressed in immaculate black tactical suits, complete with discreet earpieces and utility belts. They did not say a single word. They simply stood at attention, their expressions completely unreadable, waiting for my command. Miss Shirley let out a strangled gasp. Heather looked like she was about to faint right there on my hardwood floor. "Gentlemen," I said calmly, setting my coffee mug down. "We have a trespassing situation at the front door. Please handle it." The two contractors nodded simultaneously and walked past the terrified women heading straight for the entryway. I followed a few steps behind them, completely unbothered. Terrence was winding up to pound on the door again when the lead contractor reached out and smoothly pulled the heavy door open. Terrence stumbled forward, his fist stopping inches from the chest of a man who was easily 4 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier than him. The arrogant anger vanished from Terrence's face in an instant, replaced by absolute wide-eyed shock. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the welcome mat. Mr. Sterling dropped his battered leather briefcase, his eyes darting frantically between the two armed giants blocking the threshold. "What the hell is this?" Kendra Terrence demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his alpha male posture. "You hired muscle. Are you crazy? This is my house. Tell them to move out of the way." He took a half step forward, but the contractor simply shifted his weight, creating an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. Terrence wisely stopped moving. I stepped out from behind the security team, holding a single sheet of paper I had printed earlier that morning. I looked at Terrence, taking in his wrinkled clothes, his bloodshot eyes, and his desperate, pathetic demeanor. He looked nothing like the wealthy visionary who had demanded a divorce in front of an audience 2 nights ago. Mr. Sterling quickly recovered his legal bravado. He puffed out his chest and pointed a finger at me. "Now listen here, young lady," he started. "You cannot use armed guards to prevent a man from accessing his own residence. I have the police on speed dial, and I will not hesitate to report this gross violation of marital rights." I smiled at him, a genuine bright smile. "You must be Mr. Sterling," I said pleasantly. "The brilliant legal mind Terrence hired to handle his communications. I am so glad you could make it, because my legal counsel has been trying to reach your office all morning." I held out the sheet of paper. Sterling frowned, hesitated, and then reached out to take it. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the document. Within 5 seconds, the arrogant posture completely collapsed. He let out a low whistle and looked at Terrence with genuine pity. "What is it?" Terrence snapped, trying to snatch the paper. I did not wait for Sterling to explain. "You wanted to communicate through lawyers, Terrence," I said, my voice ringing clearly across the quiet suburban street. "So my lawyer communicated with a judge first thing this morning. What Mr. Sterling is holding is a temporary emergency restraining order granted based on your hostile and aggressive behavior at the restaurant on Friday night." Terrence stared at me, his jaw practically hitting the porch. "You filed a restraining order," he repeated, sounding like a confused child. "Yes, I did," I confirmed smoothly. "And since this property is legally owned by a trust that you have no stake in, you have no legal right to be here, which means you are currently trespassing. You have exactly 30 seconds to get off my porch before my security team physically removes you, and I have you arrested for violating a court order." Sterling immediately grabbed Terrence by the arm. "Come on, Terrence," the lawyer muttered, pulling him toward the driveway. "We need to leave right now. You cannot violate a court order. It will ruin our entire case." Terrence tried to pull his arm away, his face contorted in absolute humiliation. He looked past me, spotting his mother and Heather cowering in the hallway. "Mom, tell her she is crazy," he yelled. Miss Shirley did not say a word. She had seen the corporate trust documents. She had seen the armed guards. She finally realized that the woman she had spent years looking down on held absolute unchecked power over her son's entire existence. She grabbed Heather by the arm, pushed past the contractors, and scurried out the front door without making eye contact with me. Heather kept her head down, her floral purse clutched tightly against her chest, her threats about her judge father completely forgotten. The two women hurried down the driveway, got into Heather's car, and sped away without even offering Terrence a ride. Terrence stood alone on the lawn with his cheap lawyer completely abandoned. The neighbors were starting to peek out from their windows, watching the great entrepreneur being escorted off the premises like a common criminal. "Do not ever show your face here again," I said coldly. "If you want your computer, your lawyer can file a formal request during business hours." I stepped back inside, and the contractors pulled the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The silence that washed over the house was absolute perfection. The invaders had been repelled. The empire was secure. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my coffee mug, and let out a long, peaceful sigh. I had successfully excised the cancer from my life. Or so I thought. Just as I was turning toward the living room to finally enjoy my Sunday, a sharp electronic ping echoed off the marble countertops. I paused. The sound came from my iPad, which was sitting on the charging dock near the refrigerator. It was the specific alert tone I had set for the frozen business account. Any attempted transaction on the restricted limited liability company profile would immediately send a push notification directly to my device. I set my coffee down and walked over to the tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the secure banking dashboard. A red notification banner was flashing at the top of the screen. I opened the alert and read the transaction details. My brow furrowed in deep confusion. Someone was desperately trying to process an electronic check. The amount was precisely $4,500. The transaction had been automatically declined due to the account freeze. But it was not the amount that confused me. It was the payee. The attempted payment was directed to the leasing office of a luxury high-rise apartment complex located in the most expensive district across town. An apartment complex I had absolutely no connection to. I stared at the screen processing the data. Terrence was broke. He lived here with me. His company did not have a physical storefront, let alone a secondary corporate office in a residential building. There was absolutely no logical reason for a rent payment of that size to be pulled from our joint business account. I tapped into the transaction history, a feature I had previously ignored because I assumed all of his massive expenses were just standard entrepreneurial waste. I filtered the search by the apartment complex name. A long list of monthly payments populated the screen. Every single month, on the first of the month, for the past 2 years, $4,500 had been wired to this exact leasing office. The cold reality washed over me, replacing my confusion with a sharp, icy focus. This was not a corporate expense. This was a second life. My unemployed husband, the man who had the audacity to hand me a divorce envelope at a dinner I paid for, had been using my corporate salary to secretly fund a luxury apartment across town. An apartment I did not know we had. I picked up the iPad, my fingers gripping the aluminum edges tightly. Terrence thought the worst thing I could do was lock him out of his house and freeze his bank cards. He had no idea that he had just handed me the digital keys to his darkest secret. I stared at the iPad screen for a long time. The $4,500 decline transaction sat there like a glaring neon sign. I had cut the financial cord to protect my assets, but now I realized I needed to trace every single digital vein to see exactly where my money had been flowing. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen island mentally preparing for the war that was about to unfold when the business week officially began. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky. I took a personal day from my firm. I had my own corporate espionage to conduct. At exactly 9 in the morning, my cell phone rang. The caller identification showed the main office number for the downtown commercial high-rise where Terrence rented his headquarters. I answered the call, put it on speakerphone, and continued making my morning tea. The property manager sounded incredibly stressed. She informed me that Terrence had just shown up in the marble lobby with a rented moving truck and two of his friends. He was loudly announcing to the security staff that he was relocating his corporate assets and needed freight elevator access to clear out his luxury office furniture. The furniture, of course, that I had purchased. But there was a massive problem for the visionary entrepreneur. When I froze the limited liability company accounts on Saturday night, the automatic payment for his commercial space maintenance fees bounced. Furthermore, I had proactively emailed the property management company early Sunday morning. I submitted the official corporate documents proving I was the sole managing member and primary financial officer of the lease. In that email, I instructed them to immediately deactivate every single electronic keycard associated with his suite. Terrence was currently standing in the lobby screaming at the front desk concierge because the security gates would not even let him into the elevator bank. He was demanding a hostile takeover of his own office, claiming he was the chief executive officer and threatening to sue the building for locking him out of his livelihood. The manager asked me how I wanted to proceed. I took a calm sip of my tea. I authorized the manager to call the local police and have him removed for trespassing. Terrence had tried to play the role of the ruthless businessman, but he was quickly learning that real power does not come from wearing a velvet jacket. It comes from having your name on the actual lease. Defeated and publicly humiliated at his own commercial building, Terrence turned to his only remaining weapon, his bargain bin lawyer. By noon, my personal email inbox was flooded. Mr. Sterling sent a relentless barrage of aggressively worded legal notices, each one more hysterical than the last. The subject lines were typed in all capital letters screaming about urgent legal action, immediate demand for funds, and gross violation of marital assets. I opened a few of them just out of sheer curiosity. Sterling threatened me with massive punitive alimony claims. He wrote lengthy, dramatic paragraphs claiming I was intentionally and maliciously ruining his client's livelihood. He demanded an immediate unfreezing of the operating accounts, arguing that Terrence was a high-net-worth individual whose brand would suffer irreparable market damage if he could not access his capital today. I read the emails while sitting on my living room sofa. It was almost comical. Sterling was trying to bully a senior wealth management consultant using boilerplate legal templates he probably downloaded from a cheap internet legal site. He was threatening me with alimony when his client literally had zero documented income and could not even afford the gas to drive to his lawyer's office. They thought they could scare me into capitulating by throwing around big legal words. I did not reply. I did not forward them to my own attorney. I simply highlighted every single email from Mr. Sterling, moved them into a designated folder labeled harassment, and closed the application. I had much more important work to do than argue with a desperate man's legal mouthpiece. I carried my laptop into my home office, locked the door, and sat down at my massive oak desk. It was time to dive deep. I pulled up the master ledger for the frozen limited liability company. For 5 years I had trusted Terrence. I had let him manage the day-to-day expenses of his brand, because he constantly complained that having me audit his books stifled his creative process and showed a lack of wifely support. That was my only mistake, and I was about to rectify it with surgical precision. I downloaded 36 months of banking statements, credit card logs, wire transfer receipts, and digital payment histories. I opened my professional financial modeling software, the exact same system I used to manage portfolios for multimillionaire clients at my firm. I imported all of Terrence's data and began categorizing every single transaction. I stripped away the vague, deceptive descriptions Terrence had entered into the system. I cross-referenced vendor names, looked up routing numbers, and traced the digital footprint of every single dollar that had left my personal accounts to fund his supposed empire. I was looking for the source of that $4,500 rent payment, But what I found was so much worse. It took me 3 hours of intense, uninterrupted focus to break through his messy amateur accounting. Terrence was not a criminal mastermind. He was just a reckless, arrogant spender who thought he would never get caught because he assumed I was too busy working to check his math. The data was crystal clear and it was absolutely devastating. The failed rent payment from Sunday was just one small piece of a massive hidden puzzle. I found regular recurring wire transfers, categorized as independent contractor fees, that were actually going straight to a residential property management group. I found a secondary car insurance policy hidden under a vague business liability line item. I found thousands of dollars categorized as client entertainment and networking that were actually routed to high-end jewelers, luxury spas, and expensive lingerie boutiques. My husband had not just been failing at business. He had been actively embezzling my corporate salary to construct an entirely separate reality. The lifestyle brand was a perfectly crafted financial shield designed to drain my resources while he lived out his alpha male fantasies behind my back. He had filed for divorce because he thought his secret infrastructure was finally secure enough to support him. He just never realized that I held the master key to the entire system. The sheer audacity of his betrayal sat heavy in the quiet of my home office. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the financial modeling software illuminating my computer screens. I had expected to find incompetence. I had expected to find a man who was simply terrible at managing capital. But what I was looking at was a perfectly orchestrated system of theft. Terrence had not just failed at building a business. He had succeeded in building an entirely separate life, using my corporate salary as his personal slush fund. I focused my attention back on that $4,500 recurring charge. I cross-referenced the property management group with the limited liability company banking ledger. I needed to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. I pulled up the digitized copies of the cleared checks from the past 24 months. Every single one of them was signed by Terrence, authorized under the guise of corporate housing and executive retreats. But the rent was just the foundation of his deceit. Once I knew what to look for, the rest of the hidden expenses lit up on my screen like warning flares. I found a secondary auto insurance policy filed under a generic business liability line item. I traced the vehicle identification number attached to that policy and ran a quick public records search. It belonged to a brand new Range Rover. Terrence drove a Porsche. I drove a Mercedes. There was absolutely no reason for my company to be insuring a third luxury vehicle. Next came the wire transfers. Every 2 weeks, exactly $2,500 was transferred to an independent contractor account categorized as social media marketing consultation. I pulled the routing information and matched it to a public profile. It did not take me long to find the recipient. I opened a new tab on my browser and typed in the name. Up popped the perfectly curated social media page of a 24-year-old local Instagram model. Her entire digital presence was built around projecting an image of effortless wealth. She posted daily photos from high-end restaurants, luxury shopping trips, and tropical vacations. I scrolled through her feed, my eyes scanning the background of her perfectly filtered images. And there it was. Her latest post was a mirror selfie taken inside a sprawling floor-to-ceiling glass apartment with a breathtaking view of the downtown skyline. The exact high-rise building associated with the $4,500 monthly rent checks. In another post, she was leaning casually against the hood of a pristine white Range Rover, the exact vehicle my company was paying to insure. I sat in the glow of my monitors, clicking through photo after photo. Terrence was funneling nearly $20,000 a month into this girl. He was paying for her luxury high-rise lease, her car allowance, her designer bags, and her weekly spa treatments. He was funding her entire existence while coming home every night and complaining to me about how hard it was to secure venture capital for his brand. He had the nerve to sit at a birthday dinner I paid for wearing clothes I bought and demand a divorce because he needed a woman who respected his vision. His vision was a 24-year-old girl who was completely dependent on my bank account. A different kind of woman might have broken down right then and there. A different kind of woman might have called her mother, cried into a glass of wine, or driven across town to key his leased Porsche. But I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel out of control. I felt a cold, sharp surge of adrenaline. Terrence thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had built an impenetrable fortress for his little side piece. But he had made one massive, catastrophic mistake. Terrence was financially illiterate. He loved the idea of being a wealthy entrepreneur, but he had absolutely no understanding of corporate law or liability structuring. He wanted to live the high life, but he also wanted to avoid paying taxes on the money he was siphoning from me. So he got creative. I logged into the state business registry portal and pulled the official lease agreement for the downtown high-rise apartment. I needed to see exactly whose name was on that contract. The document loaded on my screen, and a slow, victorious smile spread across my face. Terrence had not leased the apartment under his own name. His personal credit score was entirely dependent on my accounts, and he knew a luxury building would require massive proof of independent income. He had not leased it under her name either because she was an internet model with no verifiable salary. Instead, Terrence had executed the lease under his luxury lifestyle brand. He had registered the apartment as a corporate asset, a creative studio space to write it off on his taxes. He thought it was a brilliant loophole. He thought it was the ultimate boss move. But in his arrogant stupidity, he completely forgot the most important detail of our marital financial structure. Terrence did not own the luxury lifestyle brand. I did. The prenuptial agreement and the limited liability company charter clearly designated me as the sole managing member and primary financial officer. Terrence was legally nothing more than a contracted employee with zero equity, which meant the company owned the lease. And I owned the company. I leaned forward, reading the fine print of the residential contract. I was not just the financial backer of that apartment. In the eyes of the law, I was the master tenant. That high-rise love nest belonged entirely to me. I owned the right to access it. I owned the right to terminate the lease at any time. And I owned the right to immediately evict anyone occupying the premises without my explicit corporate authorization. Terrence had unknowingly built his secret life inside a cage that I held the key to. He had used my money to construct a luxury playground, and then he legally handed me the deed. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the finest, most aggressive commercial moving company in the city. I did not want a few guys with a pickup truck. I wanted a massive, professional crew capable of clearing out a 3-bedroom penthouse in under an hour. When the dispatcher answered, I booked their premium expedited service for the following afternoon. Next, I called a licensed commercial locksmith. I arranged for them to meet me at the downtown high-rise building at precisely 2:00 tomorrow. Terrence had demanded total freedom. He had demanded that I stop hovering over his balance sheets. He had completely isolated himself legally and financially, relying solely on the advice of a bargain bin lawyer who did not understand complex corporate structuring. He was currently sleeping on his mother's lumpy couch, totally unaware that the luxury apartment he thought was his safe haven was about to be legally repossessed by the very woman he had just publicly discarded. I closed the financial modeling software and shut down my computer. The audit was complete. The evidence was secured. The trap was perfectly set. It was time to stop crunching numbers and start taking physical action. I walked out of my office feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in years. Tomorrow, I was going to pay a surprise visit to my newest real estate acquisition. After I hung up with the commercial locksmith, I realized I was far too energized to even attempt to sleep. The adrenaline was running incredibly hot through my veins. I sat back down at my heavy oak desk to finalize the export of all the financial records. If I was going to legally repossess a luxury apartment tomorrow afternoon, I needed a complete itemized inventory of the assets I technically owned inside it. I opened the detailed monthly statements for the canceled Platinum Amex card. I started combing through the retail and lifestyle purchases Terrence had made over the last quarter. I expected to find receipts for designer handbags, expensive shoes, and fine dining, and I did find those things in abundance. But as I scrolled down to a statement from exactly 4 weeks ago, a specific transaction caught my eye and made me pause. It was a charge for a premium luxury wellness retreat located downtown. The total amount was $3,200. I pulled up the digital receipt associated with the transaction. It was not a single massage or a standard facial. The receipt was for a full-day VIP package for 2 people. It included champagne service, private cabana access, and hot stone therapies. Terrence had not been to a spa. He hated places like that, claiming they did not fit his alpha male image. This was a gift for the mistress. But the package was explicitly booked for 2 guests. My curiosity was instantly piqued. I wanted to know who her little spa companion was, mostly because I wanted to know who else was enjoying the fruits of my corporate labor. I reopened my web browser and navigated back to the 24-year-old Instagram model's public profile. I scrolled down her perfectly curated grid matching the dates until I found the posts from exactly 4 weeks ago. There it was. A photo of 2 women lounging in plush white monogrammed robes, holding crystal flutes of expensive champagne. The caption read, "Besties Spa Day, courtesy of the best man ever." The mistress was smiling brightly at the camera. But the second woman had her face partially turned away, hidden behind an oversized pair of designer sunglasses. At first glance, she was just an anonymous blonde friend, enjoying a free luxury day. But then I looked closer at the hand holding the champagne glass. Wrapped around the wrist of the second woman was a very specific, incredibly gaudy, gold tennis bracelet. A bracelet I recognized instantly because I was the one who had purchased it 3 years ago as a Christmas gift for my sister-in-law. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I clicked to the next photo in the carousel. It was a short video clip of the 2 women clinking their glasses together. The blonde woman turned her head slightly, her sunglasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. The smug, entitled smirk was unmistakable. It was Heather. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the computer screen casting a cold light across my face. The woman who had stood in my kitchen just yesterday clutching her floral purse and quoting Bible verses about grace and forgiveness. The woman who had leaned across the mahogany table at the steakhouse lecturing me about how I needed to support my visionary husband. The white woman who constantly appointed herself the moral compass of our black family. She knew. She knew about the affair the entire time. But she did not just know about it. She was actively participating in the cover-up. She was hanging out with Terrence's secret girlfriend, drinking champagne paid for by my credit card, and enjoying $3,000 spa days, funded entirely by the salary she loved to criticize. A new wave of sharp, calculated anger washed over me. Terrence was a fool, a desperate man trying to buy an ego boost. But Heather was malicious. Her entire persona was a calculated performance designed to keep her free ride going. She used her proximity to Terrence's stolen wealth to live a lifestyle her own husband Jamal could not afford to give her. I turned back to the credit card statements with renewed lethal focus. I needed to see exactly how much Terrence was paying his sister-in-law to keep her mouth shut. I cross-referenced the dates immediately surrounding the spa trip. 2 days before the wellness retreat, there was a charge at a high-end diamond boutique for $5,400. The itemized receipt showed the purchase of 2 identical pairs of 2-carat diamond stud earrings. I opened my personal phone and went to our family group chat. I scrolled up to the photos from our family dinner 3 weeks ago. I zoomed in on Heather's face. Sitting right there, sparkling on her earlobes, were brand new diamond studs. I remembered that dinner vividly. Heather had loudly bragged to the whole table about the earrings, claiming Jamal had surprised her with an early anniversary gift after getting a bonus at work. Jamal had just smiled quietly, looking slightly embarrassed. Jamal was broke. He did not get a bonus. Terrence had bought Heather off with jewelry using my money, and Jamal was completely oblivious to his own wife's deception. The sheer audacity of it all was almost poetic. Heather had looked me dead in the eye and accused me of financial abuse while wearing stolen diamonds on her ears. I did not cry. I did not throw anything across the room. I simply pressed print. I printed the spa receipt. I printed the jewelry store receipt. I printed high-resolution copies of the Instagram photos showing Heather and the mistress drinking champagne together. I printed the close-up photo of Heather wearing the stolen earrings at the family dinner. I gathered the warm papers from the printer tray and placed them into a thick red legal envelope. I sealed it carefully and placed it in my work briefcase. Terrence's downfall was going to be a solo execution, but Heather's destruction was going to be a spectacular public event. She wanted to play the role of the righteous judge. I was going to serve her the hardest verdict of her life. I finally went to bed as the sun was beginning to rise over the city. I slept for exactly 4 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, I felt entirely refreshed and completely dangerous. I walked into my closet and bypassed my comfortable weekend clothes. I reached for my armor. I pulled out a sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit, the exact suit I wore when I was sitting across from hostile corporate boards demanding multi-million-dollar settlements. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and my most intimidating black stilettos. I applied my makeup with flawless precision, swept my hair back into a sleek, immovable style, and picked up my designer briefcase. I was no longer just a betrayed wife. I was the sole managing member of a limited liability company, and I was about to perform a hostile eviction on corporate property. I walked out to my Mercedes, the engine purring to life as I pressed the ignition. I pulled out of my driveway and headed straight for the downtown commercial district. The moving company had already confirmed their arrival time. The locksmith was en route. Terrence thought he could lock me out of his life. Today, I was going to literally change the locks on his entirely fake reality. I pulled my Mercedes up to the sleek glass entrance of the downtown luxury high-rise precisely at 1:45 in the afternoon. Two massive commercial moving trucks were already idling by the loading dock, their hazard lights blinking rhythmically. I stepped out of my car, smoothing the lines of my charcoal gray suit, and walked over to the foreman. He was a burly man holding a digital clipboard backed by a crew of 8 serious-looking movers, carrying heavy-duty dollies and packing crates. I confirmed the work order, handed him a copy of the corporate authorization, and told him to wait by the freight elevator. The commercial locksmith arrived exactly 2 minutes later, carrying a heavy metal toolbox. The tactical team was assembled. It was time to execute the eviction. I walked through the revolving glass doors into the sprawling marble-floored lobby. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood diffusers. The front desk concierge, a young man in a sharp uniform, immediately stood up and offered a polite smile. I did not smile back. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the polished marble counter, unclasped it, and pulled out the red legal envelope containing the printed receipts, the limited liability company charter, and the master lease agreement. I asked him to call the property manager to the front desk immediately, informing him that this was an urgent corporate compliance issue. The property manager, a tall woman with a tight bun and a stressed expression, hurried out of the back office a moment later. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I introduced myself as the sole managing member of the corporate entity that held the lease to Penthouse 4. I handed her the master lease, the corporate registry documents, and my state identification. I watched her eyes scan the paperwork. She was a professional, and she immediately recognized the absolute legal authority of the documents in front of her. She saw that Terrence was not an authorized signatory for the parent company. I informed her that the employee who had initiated this lease had engaged in gross financial misconduct, and that I was terminating the corporate housing agreement effective immediately. The manager looked nervous. She mentioned that the unit was currently occupied. I maintained my cold professional tone and reminded her that according to state commercial leasing laws, the corporate master tenant has the absolute right to repossess the property and remove any unauthorized guests if the lease is terminated due to fraud. I gave her a choice. She could either escort me up to the penthouse and facilitate a peaceful corporate repossession, or I could involve the commercial fraud division of the police department and name the building management as an accessory to embezzlement. She chose the elevator. The manager swiped her master key card, and the three of us, the manager, the locksmith, and myself, rode the silent glass elevator all the way up to the top floor. My heart was beating steadily, completely devoid of fear or sadness. We stepped out into a plush carpeted hallway. The manager knocked loudly on the heavy double doors of the penthouse, announcing herself. There was no answer. I looked at the locksmith and nodded. He stepped forward, inserted a heavy drill into the electronic deadbolt, and within 30 seconds, the locking mechanism snapped open with a sharp metallic clack. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was sickeningly beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline. The space was filled with expensive white leather sectionals, a massive glass dining table, modern art pieces, and a towering entertainment center. Every single item had been paid for by my long hours at the firm. A startled scream echoed from the master bedroom. A moment later, the 24-year-old Instagram model rushed out into the living room. She was wearing a silk robe that I recognized from a charge on my canceled platinum card. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring in absolute shock at the three people standing in her living room. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, clutching the robe tightly around her waist. "How did you get in here? I am calling the police. Get out of my apartment." She lunged for a white marble console table to grab her phone, but I held up a single manicured hand, stopping her in her tracks. "This is not your apartment," I said, my voice echoing coldly across the hardwood floors. "This is a corporate asset registered to my wealth management holding company, and you are an unauthorized squatter." The girl looked frantically at the property manager. "Tell her she cannot be here," she demanded, her voice trembling with rising panic. "My boyfriend Terrence pays for this place. He is the chief executive officer. He is going to be furious when I tell him you let some crazy woman break in." The property manager cleared her throat, looking extremely uncomfortable. "Actually, miss," she said stiffly, "this woman has provided the verified corporate documents proving she is the sole owner of the business entity that holds the lease. Terrence was never the legal tenant. The lease has just been officially terminated. You have to vacate the premises immediately." The color completely drained from the girl's heavily contoured face. She stared at me, her eyes widening as the reality of my identity finally clicked into place. She knew exactly who I was. She knew she was standing face to face with the wife who had been unknowingly funding her entire glamorous lifestyle. "You cannot do this," she stammered, trying to maintain her tough, entitled facade. "You cannot just throw me out on the street. All of my things are here, my furniture, my clothes." I smiled, a thin, ruthless line across my face. "Your clothes belong to you," I agreed politely. "I suggest you go to the bedroom and start packing them into garbage bags. But the furniture, the televisions, the rugs, and every single appliance in this unit was purchased with my corporate credit card. Therefore, they are company property." I turned to the open doorway and signaled down the hall. A second later, the heavy footsteps of the commercial moving crew echoed through the corridor. 8 massive men marched into the penthouse, carrying dollies, moving blankets, and power drills. "Clear everything," I instructed the foreman. "If it is not clothing or cheap makeup, it goes into the truck." The movers immediately sprang into action. It was a beautiful, terrifying display of efficiency. 2 men began dismantling the massive glass dining table. Another unplugged the 80-inch flat-screen television and wrapped it in a padded blanket. 3 men hoisted the custom white leather sectional into the air and began maneuvering it toward the front door. The mistress started screaming hysterically, running around the living room and trying to grab at the throw pillows. "Stop it," she cried out. "Terrence is going to destroy you for this. I am calling him right now." She snatched her phone off the marble console table just before a mover tipped it backward onto a dolly. She dialed a number, her fingers shaking violently, and put the phone to her ear. She waited and waited. I watched her face contort from anger to sheer desperation as the call went straight to voicemail. Terrence could not answer. His phone service was linked to the business account I had frozen, and he was currently sitting in his mother's house without a single active credit card to his name. "He is not going to answer," I told her calmly, watching a mover roll a designer accent chair right past her. He has no money, no business, and no power. The free ride is officially over. Just as the moving crew was wheeling the last of the living room furniture out into the hallway, my personal cell phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an incoming call from an unknown local number. I knew exactly who it was. Terrence must have borrowed a burner phone or used his mother's landline. I swiped the screen to answer and immediately pressed the speakerphone button, holding the device up so the panicked girl standing in the middle of the empty room could hear every single word. Kendra Terrence screamed, his voice completely raw and hysterical. "What the hell are you doing? The building manager just emailed me a termination notice. You cannot touch that apartment. You have absolutely no right to go near her. I swear to God, I will take you to court and ruin you." The mistress let out a pathetic sob, hearing the absolute panic and powerlessness in her supposedly wealthy boyfriend's voice. I did not raise my voice. I spoke directly into the microphone, my tone perfectly even and coated in ice. "I told you, Terrence, all communication through your lawyer," I said clearly. "You have 20 seconds to hang up before I report you for violating the restraining order." I did not wait for his response. I tapped the red button, cutting off his frantic screaming instantly. I dropped the phone back into my pocket and looked around the penthouse. The luxurious love nest was gone. Nothing remained but bare walls, empty floors, and the faint echo of my footsteps. I looked at the 24-year-old girl. She was standing in the center of the massive empty room, shivering in her expensive silk robe, completely surrounded by nothing. Her fake billionaire boyfriend could not save her. Her luxury lifestyle had evaporated into thin air. "Leave the keys on the kitchen counter on your way out," I said smoothly. I turned on my heel, my stilettos clicking sharply against the bare hardwood, and walked out of the apartment without looking back. Tuesday through Friday passed in absolute silence. Terrence did not try to call my phone again. He could not. I had completely dismantled his secret life, and he was entirely consumed by the chaotic fallout of his newly homeless mistress. But I knew my husband, and more importantly, I knew my mother-in-law. They were not going to simply accept defeat and walk away quietly. If they could not win the financial war, they were going to try and win the public relations war. I found out through the family grapevine that Miss Shirley had hurriedly organized a massive family cookout for that Saturday afternoon. In our family, a cookout hosted by Miss Shirley was never just about ribs, potato salad, and catching up. It was a strategic summit. It was the ultimate court of public opinion. She had invited every aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend within a 50-mile radius. I knew exactly what the agenda for this gathering was going to be. Miss Shirley was launching a full-scale, desperate campaign to paint me as the villain. She was going to stand by her grill and spin a tragic narrative about her good, hard-working son. She was going to tell everyone that Terrence simply wanted to find his own path, and that I, the bitter, angry corporate black woman, had maliciously destroyed his business and locked him out of his own home out of pure spite. She was going to completely omit the part where he demanded a divorce in a public restaurant, and she was certainly not going to mention the 24-year-old Instagram model who had been living on my dime. They expected me to hide inside my house, deeply ashamed and isolated. They expected me to be the invisible monster they could gossip about while they ate off paper plates in the backyard. I decided it was time to give them exactly what they were talking about. I spent Saturday morning preparing my armor. I bypassed the sharp conservative business suits I normally wore to the office and opted for something far more intimidating. I chose a stunning tailored designer sundress in a bold emerald green that perfectly complemented my skin and hugged my curves flawlessly. I paired it with thick gold accessories, oversized designer sunglasses, and a pair of strappy wedges that made me tower with absolute confidence. I made sure my hair was pressed perfectly and my makeup was immaculate. I did not look like a heartbroken, discarded wife. I looked incredibly wealthy, completely unbothered, and entirely untouchable. I grabbed the thick red legal envelope from my home office desk, the one containing all the printed receipts and photographs of Heather's ultimate betrayal, and slid it into my designer tote bag. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door. I pulled my Mercedes onto Miss Shirley's crowded suburban street just after 3 in the afternoon. The neighborhood was packed. Cars were parked haphazardly along the curbs and half up on the lawns. As I opened my car door, I could already hear the heavy, soulful bass of classic rhythm and blues thumping from her backyard. I could smell the charcoal smoke and the sweet, tangy aroma of barbecue sauce drifting through the warm afternoon air. It was a perfect, picturesque family gathering built entirely on a foundation of lies. I locked my car, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked up the concrete driveway toward the wooden side gate. I did not knock on the front door. I simply pushed the heavy wooden gate open and stepped right into the sprawling backyard. The yard was absolutely packed. At least 50 people were scattered across the freshly cut grass. Aunts and uncles were sitting under pop-up tents and folding chairs, holding red plastic cups and laughing loudly. Cousins were gathered around the cooler. In the center of the yard, sitting at a long wooden picnic table, was Terrence. He looked incredibly stressed and remarkably ragged. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and faded jeans, a massive downgrade from the bespoke velvet jackets and designer shoes he usually paraded around in. He was doing his best to play the tragic, beaten-down victim, nodding solemnly as one of his uncles patted him on the back. Jamal was sitting next to him, looking deeply uncomfortable and staring down at his plate. And right behind Terrence stood Heather. She was wearing a modest, cheap floral sundress, resting a supportive hand on Terrence's shoulder. She was playing the role of the loyal, righteous family defender to absolute perfection, completely unaware of the absolute destruction sitting quietly inside my tote bag. Miss Shirley was stationed at her massive charcoal grill on the concrete patio, flipping burgers and loudly holding court. Her voice easily carried over the music. She was right in the middle of a passionate speech, waving her spatula in the air. She was talking about how some women get a little bit of corporate money and suddenly forget how to respect the visionary men in their lives. Several older relatives were nodding along in agreement, sipping their drinks and eating my character alive. I stepped off the concrete path and onto the grass. I did not say a word. I did not announce my presence. I just walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the yard, my wedges sinking slightly into the turf. My presence registered like a silent shockwave. My cousin Marcus saw me first. He was standing near the cooler, and he stopped mid-sentence, his red cup frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes went wide behind his sunglasses. The aunties sitting in the lawn chairs nearest to the gate followed his gaze. One by one, the conversations across the yard abruptly stopped. The loud, boisterous laughter died in the throats of my in-laws. People began nudging the person standing next to them, pointing discreetly in my direction. I kept walking, my head held high, a cool, pleasant smile resting on my lips. I looked every single person in the eye as I passed them, watching them physically shrink back from my gaze. Someone standing near the deck panicked. I am still not sure who it was, but a hand reached out and hit the power button on the massive Bluetooth speaker. The classic soul music was instantly severed, plunging the crowded, chaotic backyard into a thick, suffocating silence. Every single pair of eyes in the yard turned to stare at me. Terrence slowly lifted his head from the picnic table. When he saw me standing there radiant and entirely fearless in my emerald dress, all the blood drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave he dug himself. Heather pulled her hand back from his shoulder, her fake supportive smile instantly collapsing into an expression of sheer panic. I walked right up to the edge of the concrete patio and stopped. Miss Shirley, still facing the grill, finally noticed the heavy, unnatural silence that had fallen over her party. She turned around slowly to see what had caused everyone to stop talking. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and looked across the patio. She took one look at me standing there. I was the absolute antithesis of the broken woman she had just spent the last 2 hours describing. I looked like a queen who had just walked into a peasant uprising to personally collect her taxes. Miss Shirley's jaw dropped open. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. The heavy metal barbecue tongs she was holding slipped right out of her trembling hand, hitting the concrete patio with a loud, ringing clatter that echoed violently across the silent yard. The metallic clatter of Miss Shirley's barbecue tongs hitting the concrete patio was the only sound in the entire backyard. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The aunts, uncles, and cousins just stared at me in my emerald green dress, waiting for the sky to fall. The heavy, soulful music was gone, replaced by the sound of the warm afternoon breeze rustling through the oak trees. Then Heather broke the spell. She let go of Terrence's shoulder and marched confidently across the grass toward me. She was trying to project her usual absolute authority. Her chin tipped up and her shoulders squared, but I could see a slight nervous tremor in her hands. She stopped 2 feet in front of me, planting herself directly in my path to physically block me from stepping onto the patio. "You do not belong here anymore, Kendra," Heather said, her voice loud and vibrating with fake righteousness. "This is a private family gathering. Terrence is going through enough trauma right now without you showing up to gloat. Have some dignity and leave before I call the police." I looked down at her. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I slowly reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out the thick red legal envelope. "Dignity is a fascinating word for you to use, Heather," I said smoothly. I held the red envelope out, pressing it firmly against her chest until her reflex forced her to take it. "Because there is absolutely nothing dignified about the contents of that package. Consider yourself officially served." Heather blinked, looking down at the red envelope in her hands. "Served," she repeated, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant confidence. "Served for what? That is a civil lawsuit for accessory to corporate fraud." I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard, so every single relative could hear me. "It turns out that when you help your brother-in-law embezzle my company funds to buy diamond earrings for his 24-year-old side piece, you leave a massive digital paper trail." The collective gasp from the family was audible. I heard an aunt sitting under the nearest pop-up tent whisper the words "side piece" in pure shock. Terrence shot up from the picnic table so fast he knocked his plastic cup of soda all over the grass. "Kendra, shut your mouth right now," he yelled, his voice cracking with absolute panic. I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked on Heather. All the color had instantly drained from her face. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She clutched the envelope with shaking hands, her knuckles turning white. "This is ridiculous," Heather stammered, looking around desperately at the staring family members. "She is lying. She is just a bitter, jealous woman making up crazy stories because Terrence left her. I have no idea what she is talking about." "I am not quite finished," I told her calmly. I turned my head slightly toward the wooden gate and gave a sharp nod. Right on cue, my executive assistant, a brilliant and fiercely loyal young woman named Vanessa, stepped into the backyard. She was wearing a sleek black pantsuit and carrying a high-lumen portable projector connected to a heavy-duty battery pack. She walked right past the stunned relatives, marched straight over to the side of Miss Shirley's house, and set the equipment down on a glass patio table. She quickly aimed the projector lens directly at the large blank expanse of white vinyl siding on the back of the house. "What in the world are you doing?" Miss Shirley shrieked, finally recovering her voice and stepping away from her grill. "Get that machine off my property right now. This is my house." Vanessa ignored her, completely flipping the power switch. A massive bright blue rectangle suddenly illuminated the side of the house. I pulled my iPad out of my tote bag and handed it to Vanessa. She connected the casting cable, and my screen was instantly mirrored onto the wall, easily 10 feet wide and visible to every single person in the yard. "Terrence told you all that I ruined his business out of spite," I said, projecting my voice so it commanded the entire space. "He told you I was a cold, unsupportive wife who did not believe in his dreams. So I decided to bring the actual corporate financial statements to the cookout. Let us look at his grand vision, shall we?" Vanessa tapped the screen. The first document flashed onto the side of the house. It was the highlighted accounting ledger showing the recurring rent payments. For the past 2 years, Terrence has been using my corporate salary to secretly lease a luxury downtown penthouse for his mistress, I explained, pointing at the massive projection. $4,500 a month, $54,000 a year. While he was eating the food I bought and sleeping in the house I paid for, he was funding a completely separate life for a 24-year-old girl. Terrence put his hands over his face, sinking back down onto the picnic bench. Miss Shirley shook her head violently. "That is a lie," she yelled, pointing her spatula at me. "My son is a good man. You fabricated those documents to ruin his reputation." Vanessa swiped to the next slide. It was the official corporate termination and eviction notice from the Downtown Property Management Company, dated just yesterday. Of course, because Terrence is financially illiterate, I continued, my tone dripping with icy condescension. He leased that love nest under my company name, which means I legally owned the apartment. Yesterday afternoon, I terminated the lease and had a commercial moving crew repossess every single piece of furniture inside. The little Instagram model is currently homeless, and her fake billionaire boyfriend is currently sleeping on his mother's couch because he cannot afford a hotel room. Miss Shirley let out a low wail, gripping the edge of the grill for support. She looked at Terrence, her eyes pleading for him to stand up and deny it. He just sat there, staring blankly at the grass, completely defeated. The relatives began to murmur loudly, the shock quickly mutating into disgust and outrage. But I was not done. The true masterpiece of this presentation was yet to come. "But that is not the worst part of this betrayal," I said, shifting my gaze back to Heather. "Heather told me on Sunday that I needed to be a good, supportive Black woman. She lectured me on family values after church. She told me I was financially abusing my husband." Vanessa swiped to the next image. The collective gasp that erupted from the yard this time was completely deafening. Projected 10 feet tall on the side of the house was the Instagram photo I had printed. It was Heather, wearing a plush white monogrammed robe, holding a crystal flute of champagne, smiling brightly, right next to Terrence's young mistress at the luxury spa. Heather knew about the affair the entire time, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. She went on a $3,000 luxury spa retreat, with the mistress paid for by my stolen credit card. She hung out with her. She drank champagne with her. She actively helped Terrence cover his tracks while sitting at my dinner table and eating the food I provided. "It is a fake," Heather screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "She photoshopped that. Jamal, look at me. It is a lie." Jamal, who had been sitting frozen next to Terrence this entire time, slowly stood up. His face was a mask of pure absolute devastation. He looked at the massive photo of his wife on the wall, recognizing the spa, recognizing the sunglasses, recognizing the truth. Then he looked down at Heather, who was now weeping crocodile tears and shaking her head. Vanessa swiped to the final image. It was a zoomed-in photograph of Heather sitting at a family dinner 3 weeks ago, wearing a pair of sparkling diamond stud earrings. Right next to the photo was the itemized receipt from the high-end diamond boutique, showing a purchase of $5,400 paid for by my company account. "She did not just keep the secret out of the goodness of her heart," I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow to Heather's meticulously crafted image. Terrence bought her silence. Those diamond earrings she was bragging about at dinner. The ones she claimed Jamal gave her for their anniversary after he got a big bonus at work. Terrence bought those for her using my money. Jamal took a step toward his wife. The yard was so quiet you could hear the charcoal popping in the grill. "I did not get a bonus." "Heather," Jamal said, his voice terrifyingly quiet and hollow. "I have not had a bonus in 2 years. You told me you bought those on clearance." "Jamal, please let me explain." Heather begged, reaching out to grab his arm. "Terrence made me do it. He manipulated me." Jamal violently yanked his arm away from her grasp, as if her touch burned his skin. "Do not touch me!" he roared, the sudden explosion of anger making several family members physically jump. You sat in my house, you slept in my bed, and you helped my own brother destroy his marriage using stolen money. You sold out our family for jewelry and free champagne. The silence that followed was heavy, dark, and utterly absolute. The smell of burning burgers drifted from the grill, but Miss Shirley did not move to flip them. She just stared at her two sons, her entire worldview collapsing around her. The perfect family dynamic. The lies, the entitlement, the fake moral superiority of the golden child, and the righteous sister-in-law had all been completely obliterated and projected onto a wall for everyone to see. I stood tall in my emerald dress, my head held high, watching the ashes fall around them. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply turned on the lights, and the roaches were finally scattering. The absolute destruction of Heather's pride was a magnificent thing to witness. The woman who had spent years acting as the supreme moral authority of the family was now standing in the middle of the grass, weeping uncontrollably. Her cheap floral dress, looking pathetic against the backdrop of her own massive deception. But the true tragedy of the afternoon was not Heather losing her arrogant facade. It was Jamal realizing that his entire marriage was built on a foundation of absolute disrespect. Jamal slowly turned his head away from his crying wife and locked his eyes on his younger brother. Terrence was still sitting on the picnic bench, his head in his hands, completely paralyzed by the public exposure of his secret life. Jamal took a heavy, deliberate step toward him. The older brother, who had always been quiet, supportive, and completely overshadowed by Terrence's loud alpha male persona, suddenly looked incredibly dangerous. "Look at me," Jamal commanded, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that commanded immediate obedience. Terrence flinched slowly, lifting his head. He looked like a cornered animal. "Jamal, listen to me, man." Terrence started, his voice shaking with cowardice. "It is not what it looks like. Kendra is twisting everything. She is just trying to tear us apart because she is bitter." Jamal did not yell. He did not raise his hands. He simply stood over his brother, looking down at him with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute heartbreak. "You bought my wife diamonds," Jamal said, his words sharp and deliberate. "You bought my wife diamond earrings to keep her quiet about your little 24-year-old girlfriend. And you let her sit across from me at the dinner table, smiling to my face, while I was killing myself working overtime at the plant just to pay our mortgage. You let me look like a complete fool in front of my own family." Terrence swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the yard, looking for anyone to jump in and defend him. But the aunts and uncles were completely silent. The cousins who usually cheered him on were actively taking a step back, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. Even Miss Shirley was frozen by the grill, unable to formulate a single excuse for her golden boy. "It was a business expense," Terrence stammered, offering the most pathetic, nonsensical excuse he could possibly muster. "It was networking. Heather just happened to be there." Jamal let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. "A business expense. You are not a businessman, Terrence. You are a parasite. You leeched off Kendra for 5 years to play dress-up, and when that was not enough, you infected my marriage to cover your tracks." Heather, seeing that her husband was entirely focused on Terrence, tried one last desperate attempt to salvage her ruined life. She ran over and grabbed Jamal by the arm, her tears ruining her makeup. "Jamal, please," she sobbed, burying her face against his shoulder. "We can go to counseling. We can fix this. I only did it because Terrence said he would help us out financially if I just went to the spa with her once. I was trying to help our family." Jamal looked down at the woman he had loved and provided for. He looked at the hands clutching his shirt. He slowly reached up and peeled her fingers off his arm, pushing her away with a cold final motion. "You were not trying to help our family, Heather," Jamal said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You were helping yourself to free champagne and stolen jewelry while looking down your nose at the woman who was actually paying for it. You sold out my brother's marriage, and you sold out my trust for a pair of earrings." Heather let out a loud, dramatic wail, dropping to her knees on the grass. She buried her face in her hands, realizing that her desperate manipulation tactics were completely useless. The judge's daughter, the woman who loved to quote scripture and lecture me on my duties as a black woman, was now kneeling in the dirt, entirely stripped of her fake superiority. Jamal looked at his left hand. He stared at the simple gold wedding band he had worn for the last 3 years. A ring that represented vows Heather had completely desecrated. Without a single word of hesitation, Jamal gripped the gold band and violently yanked it off his finger. Heather looked up just in time to see him throw the ring. It hit her squarely in the chest and bounced off, landing silently in the grass next to her knees. "I am contacting a divorce attorney on Monday morning," Jamal announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I want your bags packed and out of my house before I get home from my shift tonight. Do not call me. Do not text me. You can go stay with your father, the judge, since you love talking about him so much." Jamal turned around and walked straight through the crowd of stunned relatives. The sea of family members immediately parted for him, offering silent, respectful space as the older brother walked out of the backyard, opened the wooden gate, and left the cookout behind. The sound of the gate clicking shut was the final nail in the coffin of the afternoon. Miss Shirley finally collapsed into a folding chair, burying her face in her apron, weeping loudly for the absolute destruction of her family's reputation. Terrence could not handle it. The pressure of 50 pairs of eyes staring at him with undisguised contempt was breaking his fragile ego into a million tiny pieces. The murmurs were starting to rise again. I saw a few younger cousins pull out their cell phones, discreetly recording the aftermath of the absolute massacre I had just delivered. Terrence was no longer the wealthy visionary. He was the broke, cheating, manipulative fraud who had just destroyed his brother's marriage. He stood up from the picnic bench, his face flushed with a dark, furious panic. He looked at me, standing completely unbothered by the projector, and his jaw clenched tightly. "You think you won?" Terrence hissed, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "You think you can just come here and ruin my life and walk away? You are nothing without me, Kendra. You hear me? Nothing. I am going to build my empire, and I am going to make you regret the day you ever crossed me." I just smiled at him, adjusting my designer sunglasses against the afternoon glare. "I look forward to reading about your empire in the bankruptcy filings," I replied sweetly. Terrence let out a loud, frustrated scream, kicking a plastic cup across the grass. He could not win a verbal sparring match with me, and he knew it. His only option was to flee. He needed to escape the judging eyes of his family. He needed to get into his car, drive away, and pretend he was still in control of his life. "I am out of here," he yelled to nobody in particular. "I do not need this garbage. I do not need any of you." He turned his back on his weeping mother, his sobbing sister-in-law, and his completely silent extended family. He marched aggressively across the lawn, trying to adopt his old alpha male swagger, though it looked entirely pathetic given the circumstances. He pushed past his uncles and stormed through the wooden gate, heading straight for the driveway where his leased white Porsche Carrera was parked, gleaming in the sun. I signaled to Vanessa. She quickly powered down the projector and began packing the equipment back into its protective case. I took my time smoothing my emerald dress and walking leisurely toward the gate to watch his grand exit. I wanted to see the exact moment his final illusion of freedom was ripped away. Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. He aggressively pressed the unlock button. The sleek sports car responded with a sharp double chirp, the headlights flashing brightly. He reached for the driver's side door handle, ready to slide into the premium leather interior and speed away from the wreckage of his life. But before his fingers could even pull the handle, a massive, deafening blast from an air horn shattered the quiet suburban street. Terrence froze. I stepped out through the gate and leaned casually against the wooden fence, a victorious smirk playing on my lips. Backing slowly and aggressively down the street was a massive, heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow truck. The diesel engine roared loudly, pumping black exhaust into the air. The truck was painted bright yellow with the words "Premier Repossession and Recovery" stenciled on the side in bold black letters. Terrence let go of the door handle and took a step back, his eyes widening as the massive truck angled its rear wheels directly into Miss Shirley's driveway. The driver, a large man wearing a high-visibility vest, expertly maneuvered the flatbed until it was entirely blocking the driveway, completely trapping the pristine white Porsche against the garage door. The reverse alarm beeped loudly, a rhythmic mechanical countdown to Terrence's ultimate humiliation. The heavy diesel engine of the tow truck idled with a deep vibrating rumble that rattled the windows of the houses on the street. Terrence stood absolutely paralyzed in Miss Shirley's driveway, his hand still hovering inches from the door handle of the pristine white Porsche. The reverse alarm beeped in a steady, mocking rhythm. The massive flatbed truck was angled perfectly, its rear hydraulic ramp lowering slowly toward the street, completely trapping the sports car against the closed garage door. The driver killed the engine, opened the heavy steel door of the cab, and stepped out onto the pavement. He was a large, no-nonsense guy wearing heavy work boots, stained denim jeans, and a bright yellow high-visibility vest. He held a thick metal clipboard in his hands. He did not look intimidated by the upscale suburban neighborhood, and he certainly did not look intimidated by Terrence. Terrence finally snapped out of his shock. His alpha male programming kicked back in, though it was heavily tainted by pure desperation. He puffed out his chest, marched toward the end of the driveway, and pointed an angry finger at the tow truck driver. "Hey, man!" Terrence yelled, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. "What do you think you are doing? You are blocking my driveway. Back that rig up right now before I call the police. You are on private property." The driver did not even blink. He calmly walked to the rear of his truck, pulled a thick steel chain from a storage box, and looked past Terrence to the license plate of the white Porsche. He checked the number against the paperwork on his clipboard. He clicked his pen, made a heavy check mark on the page, and looked up at Terrence. "Are you Terrence?" The driver asked, his voice bored and entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes, I am Terrence," he barked back, trying to look imposing. "And I am telling you to move your truck right now. I have places to be." "I am not moving anything, buddy," the driver replied casually. "I am here for the Porsche Carrera. The vehicle is scheduled for immediate repossession due to default of payment and corporate lease termination. Step away from the car. I need to hook it up." Terrence let out a loud, incredulous laugh, looking back at his family members, who were now peeking out through the wooden gate, watching the spectacle unfold. "Repossession," Terrence scoffed, shaking his head. "You have the wrong guy, man. I am the chief executive officer of a luxury lifestyle brand. I do not get my cars repossessed. This is a bank error. Just leave the paperwork. I will call my wealth manager on Monday and sort it out. Now move the truck." I stepped away from the wooden fence and walked slowly down the driveway, my wedges clicking against the concrete. "It is not a bank error, Terrence," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the truck cooling down. "The driver is exactly where he is supposed to be." Terrence spun around to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and sheer panic. "You did this?" he accused, his voice shaking. "You called a tow truck on me." "I did not just call a tow truck," I corrected him, maintaining my calm, pleasant demeanor. "I called the dealership first thing Monday morning. I informed them that my wealth management holding company was officially withdrawing all financial backing for the vehicle lease. Since I canceled the auto pay on Saturday night, the account was already in arrears. And since the lease agreement explicitly requires a corporate guarantor, which you no longer have, the dealership immediately flagged the vehicle for recovery. I simply provided them with the address of your mother's house. I figured you would be staying here since you do not have a home anymore." Terrence stared at me, his mouth hanging open. The reality of his complete financial ruin was finally crashing down on him in real time. The car was not just a mode of transportation. It was the physical embodiment of his fake success. It was the prop he used to convince the world and his 24-year-old mistress that he was a boss. Without that car, he was just a broke, unemployed man living with his mother. And that realization absolutely broke him. The cool, calculated alpha male completely vanished. Terrence threw a full-blown, spectacular toddler tantrum right there in the middle of the street. He screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure frustration and violently kicked the front tire of the Porsche. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, stomping his feet on the concrete driveway. "You cannot do this to me, Kendra," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I need this car. I have meetings. I have investors. You are ruining my life. You are a vindictive, evil woman. You cannot just take everything from me." He turned his wrath toward the tow truck driver who was calmly unspooling a heavy steel winch cable. Terrence ran up to the driver and tried to grab the cable out of his hands. "Do not touch my car!" Terrence screamed, his face red and covered in sweat. "I am telling you, if you put a scratch on that paint, I will sue you and your entire company. I have lawyers. I will own your tow truck by the time I am done with you." The driver yanked the steel cable out of Terrence's grasp with effortless strength. "Listen to me very carefully, buddy." The driver warned, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "If you touch me or my equipment again, I am going to drop you right here on the pavement. Step back." Terrence stumbled backward, instantly intimidated by the larger man. He looked around wildly for help. "Mom!" he yelled, his voice breaking into actual tears. "Mom, tell him he cannot take my car." Miss Shirley, who had been watching in silent horror from the patio, finally sprang into action. She pushed past the remaining family members, her Sunday church hat sitting crookedly on her head, and marched down the driveway. She positioned herself directly between the front bumper of the Porsche and the approaching tow truck driver. "You are not taking my son's property," Miss Shirley declared, crossing her arms over her chest and puffing herself up to look intimidating. "Do you know who we are? You are trespassing on my property. I am going to call the police and have you arrested for grand theft auto." The tow truck driver stopped. He let out a long, exhausted sigh, reached up and tapped a small black plastic box mounted on his shirt collar. It was a body camera. "Ma'am," the driver said loudly and clearly, looking directly at Miss Shirley, "I am executing a lawful court-authorized vehicle repossession. I have the signed recovery order right here on my clipboard. By standing in front of this vehicle, you are actively interfering with a legal recovery process. That is a felony in this state. My camera is recording audio and video. If you do not move out of my way in exactly 5 seconds, I will be the one calling the police, and you will be leaving your own cookout in the back of a squad car." Miss Shirley froze. Her bluster instantly evaporated. She looked at the blinking red light on the driver's body camera. She looked at the thick stack of legal documents on his clipboard. Then she looked around the street. The commotion had drawn out the entire neighborhood. People had walked out onto their front porches. Some were standing at the edge of their manicured lawns. I saw at least 3 different neighbors holding up their smartphones, recording the entire humiliating scene. Miss Shirley realized that if she got arrested right now, the footage would be all over the local internet groups by dinner time. Her precious reputation would be completely annihilated. Miss Shirley slowly lowered her arms. She refused to look at Terrence. She stepped to the side, clearing the path for the driver. Mom, Terrence cried out, sounding exactly like a helpless child. "You cannot let them take it. Do something. I cannot go to jail for you, Terrence," Miss Shirley muttered bitterly, turning her back on him and walking quickly toward the safety of the wooden gate. "You made this mess. You deal with it." The tow truck driver wasted no more time. He crouched down, attached the heavy steel hooks to the undercarriage of the Porsche, and walked back to his control panel. He pulled a lever, and the mechanical winch engaged with a loud, whining grind. Terrence stood on the edge of the lawn, tears streaming down his face, completely powerless. He watched as the heavy steel cables pulled taut. The pristine white sports car, the symbol of his fake empire, was slowly dragged out of the driveway and hauled up the steep metal ramp of the dirty yellow flatbed truck. The sound of the metal chains clanking against the steel bed echoed through the silent neighborhood. The driver secured the tires with heavy straps, threw his clipboard into the cab, and climbed into the driver's seat. He blasted the air horn one more time, put the massive truck into gear, and slowly drove away down the suburban street, taking the last remaining shred of Terrence's identity with him. I stood on the sidewalk watching the yellow truck disappear around the corner. I turned and looked at Terrence. He was kneeling on the grass near his mother's driveway, his hands covering his face, sobbing uncontrollably in front of his entire family and half the neighborhood. He had absolutely nothing left. The execution was complete. I adjusted my tote bag on my shoulder, gave the staring neighbors a polite, radiant smile, and walked casually toward my Mercedes. I unlocked my Mercedes and slid into the driver's seat. The soft leather was cool and comforting. The neighborhood was still buzzing with the aftermath of the repossession, but I was entirely focused on the profound silence waiting for me at home. Before I could even press the ignition button, my phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. It was a rapid succession of text messages from my assistant, Vanessa. The first message was a single sentence. "You need to see this right now." The second message was a link to an active Instagram live broadcast. I tapped the link. The screen loaded, revealing the tear-streaked, heavily contoured face of Terrence's 24-year-old mistress. She was sitting in the back of a cheap ride-share vehicle, holding her phone up to her face, absolutely hysterical. The viewer count at the top of the screen was skyrocketing, jumping from 200 to over 5,000 in a matter of seconds. People love a public meltdown, and she was delivering a masterpiece. She was furious that she had just lost her luxury high-rise apartment and her pristine Range Rover in the same afternoon. But instead of quietly fading away, she decided to drag Terrence down into the mud with her. "You all think he is a boss," she screamed into the camera, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the glamorous persona she usually projected. "You think his luxury lifestyle brand is real? It is all a fake. He is a fraud. He does not have a single dollar to his name. His wife pays for everything. I just got thrown out onto the street because he could not even afford the rent." I leaned back in my car seat, watching the comments section explode with laughing emojis and shocked reactions. People were tagging their friend's screen recording the broadcast and mocking Terrence mercilessly. But the girl was not finished. She was actively dismantling his entire wardrobe and public image. "Those velvet jackets he wears on his business trips," she laughed bitterly, wiping mascara from her cheeks. "He buys them on the clearance rack at discount department stores. He cuts the tags off so nobody knows. He used to sit in my apartment and cry when his wife would not increase his weekly allowance. He is a broke, pathetic little boy pretending to be a man." The live stream was the final, devastating blow to his fake empire. In the span of 3 minutes, his reputation was completely and irreversibly annihilated. Every potential investor, every social media follower, and every person he had ever bragged to now knew the absolute truth. Terrence was a parasite living off his wife's corporate salary. I locked my phone, started the engine, and drove away from Miss Shirley's neighborhood with a profound sense of satisfaction. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, the digital execution was followed by a legal one. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and opened my laptop. Sitting right at the top of my inbox was a formal email from the office of Mr. Sterling. I opened the message and read the attached PDF document. It was a formal notice of withdrawal of counsel. Terrence had written Mr. Sterling a substantial check for his legal retainer on Friday afternoon, expecting the funds to pull from our joint business account. But because I had frozen that account on Saturday night, the check bounced completely. Mr. Sterling was a cheap lawyer, but even cheap lawyers do not work for free. The document stated that effective immediately, Terrence was entirely without legal representation. I closed the laptop and smiled. Terrence had demanded a divorce. He had demanded we communicate through lawyers. Now he had no car, no business, no mistress, no lawyer, and absolutely no money. He was completely stripped bare, left with nothing but the reality of his own catastrophic arrogance. 2 entire weeks passed since that explosive Saturday afternoon, 14 days of absolute uninterrupted peace. The family grapevine, fueled by aunts and cousins who could not stop talking about the projector presentation, kept me informed of the glorious aftermath. Jamal had followed through on his promise. When Heather returned to their house after the cookout, she found all of her belongings packed into black garbage bags and piled on the front porch. Jamal had changed the locks and officially filed for divorce. Heather was completely exiled. The woman who loved to act like high society, who flaunted her stolen diamond earrings and judged everyone around her, was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. Her arrogant attitude was entirely shattered, replaced by the humiliating reality of living under her father's roof as a disgraced, unemployed, soon-to-be ex-wife. As for Terrence, his situation was even more pathetic. Without his car, he was completely trapped in the suburbs. Without his mistress, his ego had completely deflated. He was sleeping every single night on Miss Shirley's lumpy floral living room couch. The mother who had fiercely defended her visionary son was now stuck supporting a 37-year-old man who spent his days staring blankly at the television, completely paralyzed by his own failure. I, on the other hand, was thriving. It was a Tuesday evening and a heavy thunderstorm was raging outside. The rain lashed violently against the large bay windows of my living room while the wind howled through the trees. Inside, however, the atmosphere was warm and perfectly serene. I had a fire crackling brightly in the massive stone fireplace. I was curled up on my plush sofa, wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater, reviewing a massive new portfolio for a prospective multi-million-dollar client. My career was accelerating rapidly now that I was no longer carrying the dead weight of a fake entrepreneur. I took a slow sip of an expensive red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I highlighted a crucial line in the financial prospectus, entirely focused on my future. Then, the quiet sanctuary of my home was abruptly interrupted. It started as a faint sound over the roaring thunder. Then it grew louder. It was a frantic, desperate knocking at my heavy oak front door. Someone was pounding their fist against the wood with absolute urgency. I did not jump. I simply placed my wine glass on the coffee table and picked up my iPad. I opened the security camera application and pulled up the front porch feed. The night vision camera cut through the darkness and the heavy rain illuminating the person standing on my doorstep. It was Terrence. He was standing in the pouring rain, completely soaked to the bone. He did not have an umbrella. He was not wearing a bespoke velvet jacket or designer shoes. He was wearing a cheap, oversized raincoat that probably belonged to his mother, and his shoulders were completely slumped. The man who had confidently handed me a divorce envelope in a luxury steakhouse just 2 weeks ago now looked like a stray dog begging for scraps. He raised his fist and pounded on the door again, his mouth moving as he yelled my name into the stormy night. I sat on my warm sofa, the fire crackling beside me, and watched him drown in the reality he had created. I watched the security monitor for a long moment. The man who had humiliated me in front of his entire family, who had funneled my hard-earned money to a 24-year-old girl, was now standing in the freezing rain, pounding on my reinforced front door. I took another slow, appreciative sip of my red wine. I did not feel pity. I did not feel a sudden surge of lingering love. I felt the absolute unshakable power of a woman who had completely reclaimed her territory. I set my iPad down on the kitchen island, picked up my wine glass by its delicate crystal stem, and walked unhurriedly toward the front hallway. The pounding continued, accompanied by the muffled sound of Terrence begging me to open up. I stopped at the door, disabled the perimeter alarm with a few taps on the wall panel, and reached for the heavy brass deadbolt. I turned it with a loud, deliberate click. I opened the heavy oak door just a few inches, leaving the security chain firmly attached. A gust of cold, wet wind immediately swept into the warm hallway, but I did not shiver. I stood tall, perfectly framed by the warm glow of the chandelier behind me, and looked out into the darkness. Terrence practically collapsed against the doorframe when he saw my face. He was a miserable, pathetic sight. The heavy thunderstorm had completely soaked through his cheap, oversized raincoat. His hair was matted to his forehead, and water was dripping continuously from his nose and chin. In his shaking right hand, he held a crushed, incredibly sad bouquet of grocery store carnations, still wrapped in the crinkling plastic sleeve with the $5 price tag visible on the barcode. "Kendra," he gasped, his voice raspy and choked with actual sobs. "Thank God. Thank God you opened the door. I did not say a word. I just stood there holding my wine glass, staring at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. Please let me come inside. He begged, his teeth actually chattering from the cold. It is freezing out here. I have nowhere else to go. My mother kicked me out. She said she could not afford to feed me, and she was tired of me sleeping on her couch. Jamal will not even answer my phone calls. I lost everything, Kendra. I have absolutely nothing. He pushed his wet face closer to the gap in the door, trying to force his way into my line of sight, trying to find the supportive, forgiving wife he had completely taken for granted. I was stupid, he cried, the tears mixing freely with the rain pouring down his face. I was so incredibly stupid. That girl meant absolutely nothing to me. She was just a distraction, a terrible mistake. You are my wife. You are the only woman who ever truly held me down. We belong together, Kendra. I am the man of this house. We can fix this. We can rebuild my brand. We can rebuild our marriage. Just unchain the door and let me come home. Please. I listened to his entire desperate speech. Even now, standing homeless in a thunderstorm holding discount flowers, his massive ego was still trying to survive. He still referred to himself as the man of the house. He still thought he was entitled to cross my threshold and demand a reconstruction of the life he had voluntarily destroyed. He truly believed that a few tears and an apology would instantly erase years of financial abuse and emotional betrayal. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell over the sound of the raging storm. I simply looked down at him, my expression completely blank, and took another slow, luxurious sip of my expensive red wine. The dark liquid warmed my throat, a sharp contrast to the freezing reality he was currently drowning in. You told me you outgrew this marriage, Terrence, I said softly. My voice was calm, but the words cut through the cold air like a perfectly sharpened blade. No, that was just talk, he stammered frantically, shaking his head and spraying water everywhere. I was just acting tough for the boys. I did not mean a single word of it. You handed me a manila envelope in the middle of a premium steakhouse. I continued, ignoring his pathetic interruptions. You sat at the head of a mahogany table, wearing clothes I paid for, eating food I purchased, and you smirked at me. You demanded a divorce in front of an audience. You proudly announced that from that second on all communication must go through your lawyer. I lowered my wine glass and leaned slightly closer to the gap in the door, making sure he could see the absolute 0-degree temperature in my eyes. But right now, Terrence, you do not even have the credit score to afford a legal consultation, I whispered. You do not have a lawyer. You do not have a business. You do not have a car. And you certainly do not have a wife. You wanted total freedom to be an alpha male. I gave it to you. This is what your freedom looks like. It looks like you standing in the rain begging the woman you betrayed to save you from your own stupidity. Kendra, please, he wailed, dropping straight down onto his knees on the hard, wet concrete of the porch. The grocery store carnations fell from his hands, splashing into a puddle. Do not do this to me. I will do anything. I will get a job. I will work for you. Just do not leave me out here like this. I looked down at the man kneeling in the puddles at my front door. This was the grand finale, the complete destruction of his arrogant facade. I reached my free hand into the pocket of my cashmere sweater. I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I crumpled it slightly in my fist, pushed it through the gap in the door, and dropped it directly onto the wet concrete right next to his ruined flowers. Get an Uber back to your mama's couch, I commanded, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. We are completely done. I pushed the door shut. The heavy oak slammed into the frame with a loud, definitive thud, instantly cutting off his pathetic wailing. I turned the brass deadbolt, locking him out of my life forever. I stood in the hallway for just a moment, listening to the rain beat against the roof. The house was entirely silent, safe, and unconditionally mine. I walked back into my living room, sat down on my plush sofa by the roaring fire, and went right back to reviewing my multi-million-dollar client portfolio. I did not think about him for the rest of the night. 6 months later, the dark clouds had completely cleared from my life. The sun was shining brightly over the city, and I was absolutely thriving. Once I cut the financial dead weight of Terrence's fake empire from my accounts, my personal wealth skyrocketed. I poured all of my newfound energy, time, and capital directly into my career. My wealth management firm recognized my relentless focus and promoted me to senior partner. I had doubled my high net worth clientele, and my bank accounts reflected a level of success I had only ever dreamed of while I was busy funding his delusions. It was a gorgeous Sunday afternoon. I was out at a beautiful, highly exclusive brunch spot, situated on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the city skyline. I was not sitting with toxic family members or condescending in-laws. I was surrounded by my real friends. Smart, ambitious, fiercely loyal women who celebrated my success instead of trying to tear me down. We spent 3 hours drinking bottomless mimosas, eating artisanal pastries, and laughing until our sides hurt. I was wearing a stunning custom-tailored ivory silk suit that draped perfectly over my frame. I felt radiant. I felt powerful. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely at peace. As the brunch wound down and we paid our check, we walked out of the restaurant and stepped onto the warm, sunlit pavement of the valet loading zone. I hugged my friends goodbye, promising to see them at our next networking gala, and stepped up to the valet podium to hand the attendant my ticket. "I will have your vehicle brought right around, Ma," the attendant said politely, speaking into his radio. I stood on the curb, enjoying the warm breeze, adjusting my designer sunglasses. A minute later, the familiar, aggressive purr of my pristine black Mercedes echoed down the driveway. The car pulled up smoothly to the curb, the tires resting perfectly aligned with the red-painted zone. The driver's side door opened, and the valet stepped out. He was wearing a cheap, poorly fitting uniform consisting of stiff black pants and a bright red polo shirt, with the restaurant's logo embroidered on the chest. He kept his head down as he quickly jogged around the front of the car to open the passenger door for me. As he reached out to hand me my electronic key fob, he finally looked up. It was Terrence. He froze completely. The key fob trembled in his hand. His face was visibly thinner, deeply lined with exhaustion and the harsh reality of actual physical labor. The man who used to refuse to wake up before noon because it stifled his creative vision was now spending his Sundays sprinting across hot asphalt to fetch cars for wealthy patrons. He looked at my flawless ivory silk suit. He looked at my glowing, unbothered face. And then he looked down at his own cheap red polyester uniform. The sheer crushing weight of his shame was palpable. It radiated off him in waves. He could not maintain eye contact for more than a second. He quickly lowered his head, staring firmly at the concrete sidewalk, completely stripped of every single ounce of the arrogance he once wore like armor. He held the keys out to me, his hand shaking slightly, entirely silent. I did not gasp. I did not smile triumphantly. I did not offer him a single word of recognition, pity, or closure. I looked at him with the exact same level of polite indifference I would give to an absolute stranger. I took my keys from his hand. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out a $5 bill, and casually handed it to him. "Keep up the good work," I said smoothly. I stepped into my beautiful car, the door shutting behind me with a solid, expensive thud. I pressed the ignition, put the car into drive, and pulled smoothly away from the curb. I merged into the afternoon traffic, driving straight into my beautiful, wealthy, entirely drama-free life. I looked in my rearview mirror one last time, watching his figure shrink into the distance until he completely disappeared from my view. And I never looked back again. If you have ever had to ruthlessly cut a toxic person out of your life to finally reach your true potential, let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about taking back your power and building your own empire. Until next time, stay strong and know your worth.